You have either on purpose or on accident joined the science panel meeting for today. You should see on your Zoom screen some combination of Brady Bunch faces and the agenda. So let's just have a quick gander at that agenda. You'll see that we're at an hour and a half today. This is another one of our sort of quick focused meetings. Most of our conversation time today will be focused on a discussion with Kateri on the CMP study. And then we just want to talk for just a quick minute on P-binding, and then a couple of quick updates on the other studies. And of course, we will take public involvement on all of those things along the way. I do want to do just a super duper quick review, just so we all have it fresh in our minds, that we do have a couple of ground rules and some process commitments that might serve us well in today's conversation. So on the process side, as we're listening and talking with each other on some of these challenging issues, would love for you just to be mindful that when other folks are talking, just listen to learn, hear what they're saying, as opposed to listening to respond. Your job here is to try to understand. You don't have to agree, but it'd be cool if you could understand what folks are saying. Of course, respectful conversation is great, but that doesn't mean we can't be honest. We can be candid, we can be constructive, but we can also be respectful and kind. Where we're going to have differences, if we have them, let's seek to solve them and reach some consensus. We'll talk together, of course, and I'm not expecting surprises to be an issue today. In terms of ground rules, this is the job today. CNP, #1 priority. We got to get through that today because we're burning against a time clock there. And then some other quick updates. There are other things you all will discuss that the steering committee will discuss, but not today. Of course, one person speaking at a time. If you could use a little hand raise. If you have your camera on, I'm happy to have this be your hand raise. And if your camera's off, or if you prefer, you can use that little digital hand in the Zoom screen. It's under reactions at the bottom of the screen, and sometimes it gets overshadowed by all the cool party ones, but it's on there. And then obviously share the speaking time, listen with respect, be civil. And the two that I put in italics here, just side conversations and turning off cell phones if we're in person. In a Zoom environment, mostly what that is to me is try not to multitask and be reading your email and all the things at the same time. I know it's hard with all the beeping and the blinking and the notifications, but if you could stay with us the whole time, that'd be great. Just a couple quick things to keep in mind. If we're going to disagree today, instead of telling folks, hey, you're wrong, that's wrong, you could just tell them, I don't agree with that. Instead of telling folks, maybe, you're not listening, you might say instead, maybe I'm not as clear, let me be clear and say what I was saying again. Instead of saying that's not what happened, you can say, I hear your point, I remember that differently, or I see that differently. And again, we've talked about this before. Instead of no, because, if we could get focused on that yes, if language, that would be glorious. So just to save time today, instead of doing a verbal icebreaker, I would love to have you do a Zoom icebreaker, which is to tell us what is your favorite barbecue food. And you do that by annotating your own name in the participant list. You can right click on your picture, you can right click on your name. Samuel and I will show you here real quick. It goes like this. Instead of saying Heather Bergman at Peak Facilitation, Heather Bergman is going to say, oh, there's so many things I like at a barbecue, but man, potato salad, I'm all about it. So it looks like that. So if you just for funsies do that, we can all be joyful summer people, because it's coming. Apparently it's already in North Carolina, but for the rest of us, it is coming. So with that, I just want to let everyone know we do now have Theron and Greg. So we're pretty close to our whole crew. And let's get after it. Kateri, you have lots of stuff to chat with our friends about, and you may share your screen and your slides at your convenience, unless Mitch or Eric or anyone wants to say anything to the group before we jump on in. Mitch is good. Mitch Korn, man after my own heart. Eric, you good? Cool. Greg likes fruit salad. I respect that. It's a healthy choice. Soren's just being honest. It's all about the ribs. All right. Anybody else want to participate? Love to see your thoughts. In the meantime, Kateri, take it away.
That's good. Didn't have quite enough time to put up my idea for my barbecue food, but hopefully this will be just as tantalizing. Okay. So here's an update on the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus budget project that Tetra Tech has been working on. Last time we had a really productive discussion and made some decisions about moving forward. So I'm hoping today will be a lot more of that discussion and moving forward. A few topics to get to today. Just a few quick updates on nutrient and flow monitoring protocols. I've got some preliminary water budget results to share with everybody. Also some preliminary results from the flow and loading from unmonitored watersheds. And then the big discussion today, which I'm hoping to get some feedback on, is defining lake elevation and then working with tributary monitoring data, as well as the discharge monitoring reports from the wastewater treatment plants. So that'll be the list in succession. Just a few follow-ups from last meeting. So we followed up with Wasatch Front Water Quality Council on their TN protocol. It was listed in the water quality portal as a TKN protocol. And I just followed up that actual protocol calculates TKN from measuring TN as well as nitrate, nitrite. So all three of those pools of nitrogen are quantified for that method. So we'll end up moving forward with using those values because they are truly TN values rather than TKN values. So that was just a quick update. I know there's some concern there looking at that methodology, but we're good to go there. Did a little bit of follow-up with the streamflow methodology from Wasatch Front Water Quality Council. We had some raw data from 2018 that indicated that 5 or fewer cross sections were used to generate discharge. According to the USGS flow methodology to measure discharge in the stream, a minimum of 10 cross sections is recommended. So this is obviously many more cross sections than were used, at least in the raw data that we have. So I wanted to follow up if Theron or others have any documentation to share, or if there's any sort of written information that we have that might help to kind of clear up that question of whether Wasatch Front is using the USGS methodology.
Anyone have any questions, comments? Okay.
Well, I could just say that, you know, I haven't written anything up other than just that basically you've got it summarized there that, you know, we'll do a minimum of 10, it's not cross sections, but 10 points across a cross-sectional transect. So, but, you know, it's pretty much what it's spelled out in the USGS documentation. We have, since our discussion a month or so ago, we have initiated up to 20, you know, if it's wider than about 10 meters, we will do, you know, 15 or 20 points across a transect. So we've changed that methodology a little bit to try to get more, you know, more points across the transect. And then what we're going to do along with that is we're going to do a comparison of, let's just do like we have done, the 10 points across the transect, and then compare that with doing the 15 or 20, just to look at a statistical comparison of if there's any difference in our cross sections where we do those samples. So that's what we're doing right now.
Gotcha. So in the data that we have for the budget study, it's only data from 2015 through 2018. And then, like I said, the raw data indicated that only 5 or fewer cross sections were used, 5 or fewer points across the stream width. So if you have any, you know, actual raw data or data that you can share that demonstrates that those 10 cross sections were used, that would be helpful. Because right now we don't have confirmation that that was happening.
And this is in the context of different flows measured between Division of Water Quality, where we have known protocols, and Wasatch Front Water Quality, where we are unknown protocols.
Correct. Yeah, this is just in the context of Wasatch Front Water Quality Council.
I would lean towards using data that we know meets the criteria we were going with, which unfortunately with Wasatch Front Water Quality can't provide information.
The only time when we do the 5 is when the stream is less than 10 meters wide or like 5 meters wide. So, I mean, you know, it just would be ridiculous to do a transect every foot.
Okay, hold on one
You know,
second.
that's,
So,
that's where we're trying to settle at. So we're saying why we should do it every foot across the 15 or 20-foot wide stream. That's what the point is.
And I think the
Right.
concern is if
So
you
it's not
did
like
it non.
Aaron,
it out.
please stop interrupting. Let Mitch finish his thought, and then I will call on you to share your perspective. Mitch, please finish, and then we will go to
Well,
Theron.
I was just going to say, if there are similar sites and there's big differences and one person's using an accepted protocol, why would we be debating over something that it doesn't meet the criteria or can't be proved? That's where I stand.
Okay.
So I don't know where the differences are going at the moment.
Theron, go.
like I say, the only points where that was the case was when there's a really narrow streams. And so, and that wasn't some of that older data. So the more recent data, we have changed that to do a minimum of 10 transection. And if it's wider than 10 meters, we're doing 15 or 20. So, you know, it's just a matter of how much time we have to make, you know, to sample 15 sites around the lake or more. And so, like I said, we're going to do that comparison to show if there's any statistical difference between doing, you know, I know the 5 sites isn't, you know, supposedly going to be accurate, but we'll still have that data to compare that with doing the 10 or 15 or 20 sites across the transect. So, and we'll compare that with, you know, the state's data that's, you know, at the same site. So, and what we've seen is I don't think there's that much difference anyway, except at that one site on Battle Creek.
Okay.
So
Mitch has his
anyway,
hand up.
that's my point.
Yep, gotcha. Okay, Mitch has his hand up, then I'd love to hear if any other members of the science panel have thoughts on this one. Mitch, go ahead.
I think if we're seeing discrepancies between the data we know, flow data that was collected in a certain way, and others, we should not use the older data, but I do think we should keep it on the table as Theron, you know, proves his methods. I mean, I just want to point out, he just said that based on their timing, they sample how much time they have. So that's not the way we sample, you know, these things. You have to hit the protocols. So I would recommend, you know, prove your data, it works, you know, your old methods are, you know, comparable.
All right, let's hear from other folks on the science panel. You have thoughts on this? Mike, Brett, you got a question in the chat?
I can answer that. So this was all of the sites, in at least from the 2018 spreadsheet that I have, used 5 or fewer cross sections. So every single site was 5 or fewer.
And is it a higher frequency in subsequent years in 2019 and 20?
I don't have those data, so those data weren't available. So the only data we're working with for Wasatch Front Water Quality Council are 2015 through 2018. Those are not, the more recent data are not in Water Quality Portal.
I guess my suggestion right now is maybe we need to put the flow data from 2018 on hold until we get better resolution on the velocity measurements.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Yep. Other thoughts?
So how does that, so 2019, 2020, we're not using Wasatch Front Water Quality data, we're using Division of Water Quality. So we're just going to stop the whole process just because we know unknown protocols?
So I guess a few of the paths forward would be, one, to use only DWQ data for flow, which would mean that we'd only be using those for load as well, since that's how load is calculated, is partly with flow. The other option in my mind would be to look at the watersheds and where the Wasatch Front Water Quality Council measurements match up with the distributions of DWQ measurements. We could use those, and in cases where they have a discrepancy, then only use DWQ data. So those would kind of be the 2 options in my mind that I think would be valid in this case.
Okay. Mitch, one of those or the other appeal to you?
I like the second one because I'm not trying to discredit anyone's data right here. I just, you know, if there's concerns and we don't know how it was gathered, I just want to make sure that, yeah, we're sticking with, but I would recommend looking at both in the parent.
All right. Other folks agree? You incline toward that second option that Kateri identified, using both where they are sort of similar. Is that roughly what you said? Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, if I recall correctly, it was only 2 of those watersheds, at least for the non-wastewater treatment plant group, that had a big discrepancy.
And Mike's wondering if this challenge will be fixed or addressed in subsequent years. And Mike, by this, do you mean the protocol question?
Yeah,
Or the front
that-
data?
the low number of velocity determinations across the cross section.
Mhm.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Theron. Theron, what do you think? Can you live with this second option that Kateri identified? Using both where they're fairly consistent?
Well, sure. Like I say, except for, that maybe that one side on Battle Creek, there was overlap in all of the data sets. So, to me, and the water chemistry was pretty similar as well. So I don't have any issue with any of it.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Any other members of the science panel have a perspective? Anyone want to make the case for option 1? Silence now means I can live with option 2, which is using both where they're fairly consistent. Speak up or be forever believed to have thought option 2 was groovy. Sounds like option 2 is groovy, Kateri.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Mike. I see you in the chat.
Okay, another follow-up I had on my list was following up with nutrient protocols. So this is just an update on the lower reporting limits and the minimum detection limits for phosphorus and nitrogen between the two entities. These should be updated and reflect the verbal conversation that happened last time. So hopefully this should be consistent with what everybody walked away with last time. An insight into how this impacted the data set. So any values that were below the detection limit, so the minimum detection limit noted in the white part of the table, those were set at half of the minimum detection limit. If a value was above the detection limit and less than the reporting limit, this would be a J flag. It was retained as is in the data set. There were several watersheds where Wasatch Front Water Quality Council data were below the detection and reporting limits. So only DWQ samples were used in these cases, and it's noted whether that was phosphorus, nitrogen, or phosphorus and nitrogen in those cases. This was just due to the fact that it's a less sensitive methodology.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any questions or comments on that? I see nodding from the folks with cameras on.
Great. Yeah, this should be consistent with what we discussed last time. It's just a quick follow-up for everybody's information.
Okay.
Okay, so moving on to a little summary of the hydrologic budget. As a reminder, we are using direct measurements for some of the inputs and outputs, and some of them from the EFDC estimates, which the science panel should be familiar with. Specifically groundwater, precipitation, and evaporation. So those are all used from the EFDC estimates. So stream flow and monitored watersheds was used by a direct measurement. We used a Model My Watershed model to estimate stream flow and runoff from unmonitored watersheds. I'll get to that in a minute. And then there's daily direct measurements of outflow from the Jordan River as well. So I'll get into each of these as they come up, but that's kind of a sneak peek of where things are coming from. So inflow, this pertains to stream inflow, the totals around the watershed. This study came out to be fairly similar to all of the other previous estimates. It came out right in the middle of previous estimates. I thought this was a really good sign because it's suggesting that monitored flow is neither over nor under predicted compared to other approaches. The potential worry there is that grab sampling might bias, for either wet or dry periods compared to something like a hydrologic model. But since we're seeing pretty consistent stream flow measurements compared with the other estimates from previous years, this suggests that we can estimate the loads with some certainty there. The Jordan River outflow, I'll note that the years between the studies that were monitored are quite different. So this is the only study that's using these most recent set of years, 2015 through 2020. The stream flow that we measured as part of this study was much lower than other studies that have been done, so 127,000 acre feet per year. This might be due to a few factors. First, we're using the daily outflow values at the Narrows paired with the nutrients at the outflow. So the only days that are actually going into the estimates are the days when there is a paired nutrient value. That turns out to not make a big difference in the actual outflow budget. So the estimate there would be about 10,000 acre feet per year larger if we were to use the daily data from the Narrows. So pretty consistent there. A few other differences is that for December through February, when the crew went out to actually measure nutrient concentrations in the Jordan flow outflow, when the flow there was observed at 0, we replaced a 0 value with a non-zero value at the Narrows. Since that station at the Narrows is further downstream, and if we're observing 0 outflow at the direct outlet of Utah Lake, that would trump the estimate of outflow at the Narrows in that case. So a few caveats there just to share. I'll also point out that these years the lake was gaining in elevation overall, and the outflow from the Jordan River was lower during those years. So perhaps not as big of a concern there, just because we are getting a lot of interannual variability in the Jordan River outflow. So how do the inflows and outflows influence the overall budget? So this is the hydrologic budget of this study on the left compared to the EFDC WASP output on the top right-hand side, and then the Lake Sim output from the SOMAS and SWCA report on the bottom right. Just a couple of highlights. The mean inflows, they're coming out to be about the same for streams and runoff compared to previous estimates. Groundwater and precipitation, particularly for EFDC WASP, are quite consistent, not surprising since those are the actual values that we're using for this report. Because the outflow from the Jordan River was lower than in previous studies, the proportion of outflow that's attributed to the Jordan River is lower in percentage in this study than previous studies. And I will also note that the lake was rising over this period, so an average of net positive water balance of 88,000 acre feet per year. So that's not pictured here, but just to note that the positive elements of the water budget outweigh the negative elements.
Carrie, do you want to take questions along the way?
Yeah, Mike, if you've got a question, I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, I do. Can you go back a slide?
Sure.
So when you're showing that these different flow estimates, how well do they match when you compare years head to head? So like in each case, you're comparing a different set of years, and you're saying that the outflow from Utah Lake is very variable from one year to another. But what if you just compare, like you have 2015 to 2018 as common between the first two?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the Sue and von Stackelberg report, we're using the exact same data. So they're using also daily data as measured at the Narrows. So those should be exactly the same numbers since we're generating those estimates from the same data, assuming it's the same year.
So the lower estimate is just because of the years you happen to have picked were different than the years other people picked. Otherwise, yeah,
that's the estimate, and all the other parts that we could have chased down, we accounted for those potential differences. So we're pretty confident that the Jordan River was just drier in these years than in previous years.
Because getting the amount of water that flows out through the Jordan River and the amount that goes out for evaporation is really important for understanding the nutrient mass balance. So this is something we really want to make sure we get it right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I know 2011 was a really wet year, so that's or a really high discharge year for the Jordan River. So that's included in the two middle estimates. I'm not sure what was going on in the 80s and 90s, but presumably those were wetter years as well.
But you're saying,
and these are daily data, which I think is as good as it gets in terms of outflow estimates.
So during the years that we focused on for the nutrient data, the last 5 years, you're saying that 70% of the water that leaves Utah Lake is leaving via evaporation.
Yeah, according to these estimates, that would be the case.
That's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, James had a question about comparing to the observed lake volume and elevations. So that would be kind of the next step that would come from this. These estimates are fresh off the presses, so that'll be end of this week into next week. We'll compare those to the lake volume changes, just to verify that it's all balancing out in the right way.
I'm thinking that I'm going to do it.
Hey, Rich.
Is that Jake?
No.
Oh.
That was Rich, but remember, we're only taking comments right now from members of the science panel. You can pop it in the chat and we can circle back to it later though, Rich. Okay. Anybody else have a question on this component? This data still has that new car smell. All right, carry on.
Okay, great. Another aspect of this effort is to estimate loads and flows from unmonitored watersheds. The original plan was to use a paired watershed approach. So basically take any of the monitored watersheds and assign them to a similar unmonitored watershed and scale for area to estimate those loads. The issue here that we identified is that several watersheds have ephemeral flow rather than perennial or intermittent flow, and there wasn't really any monitored counterpart that would make sense to use that paired watershed approach. So the revised plan that we put into play is using a relatively simple model to estimate flows and nutrient loads. This is sort of teeing ourselves up for knowing that there's going to be a big watershed modeling effort moving forward in the next several years. So something simple to just kind of get a general idea of what we're working with from those unmonitored watersheds. So we use the Model My Watershed model, specifically the watershed multi-year model. This uses the generalized watershed loading function enhanced model. For the hydrology of that model, it's using the NHD Plus version 2 medium resolution flow lines. This includes watersheds with ephemeral flow, so that's a good thing in terms of being able to reproduce those types of flows. In terms of nutrient loading, it accounts for farm animal populations, point sources, sources from land cover, and then soil, nitrogen, and phosphorus as well. Just wanted to note the calibration of this model was conducted for some Western watersheds, Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, or was that, sorry, that might be Arizona, I'm mixing them up, but no calibration efforts in Utah. So that's just a caveat of this model, is that this wasn't calibrated specifically for the purpose of Utah. So we ran the watershed multi-year model for 54 of the unmonitored watersheds. Most of them are really small, so I'll show a map of those in a second. It sounds like a lot, but they're making up a very small area of the overall watershed. So the output was monthly hydrology as well as annual nutrient and sediment loads going to the lake from those watersheds. The hydrology included overland flow and stream flow, which we added together to indicate the surface flow. And then nutrients, TN and TP, which can be parsed into these multiple sources, although we just use the total. So here are some of these results. Just noting any of the ones in the gray are the monitored watersheds, so making up the lion's share of the total area of the input to Utah Lake. And then any of the ones that are not gray are the unmonitored watersheds. So we've got the inflow in acre feet per year on the left, TN load, total nitrogen load in the center, and then the total phosphorus load on the right-hand side. Mostly we're seeing very low loads of nutrients and intermediate loads of water. Mike, you've got a question. How do the modeled stream concentrations compare to the observed concentrations for adjacent streams? Could you elaborate on that question?
Yeah, I mean, in this area where you have these streams that are unsampled, you have, in some cases, small catchments right next to the unsampled ones that are sampled. So it doesn't surprise me that you would say the loads are low, because probably the flow coming out of these areas is really low. But I'm curious about what the concentrations are coming out of
the actual concentrations.
yeah, if you were to compare them to, there's these little gray catchments right next to the yellow catchments that that do have data. So if you were to compare the ones that do have data to the ones that are only modeled, are the nutrient concentrations in the same ballpark? Or are they substantially different?
Sure. Yeah. So unfortunately, this model only produces the loads rather than the concentrations, but we can compare loads directly, particularly, if we've got pretty similar land use, especially in these adjacent catchments, like I'm thinking at the north end of the lake. Or
doesn't it give you flow as well?
It does, but they're generated from different components of the model. So we could probably back calculate them, but I think perhaps a direct comparison of the loading and comparison and equating those with the area would maybe be a more direct option.
We need to know how much water is coming from those areas, don't we, to complete the water balance for the lake?
Yeah, so that's why we're using the inflow from the unmonitored areas.
Okay. So you have like an aerial yield of water from the unmonitored areas.
Correct. Yeah. So we've got an amount of acre feet per year from each of these watersheds. The darker it is, the larger the hydraulic or the hydrologic budget for that specific catchment.
Is that coming from the model, or is that coming from something you directly estimate?
That's coming from the model.
Okay. So you do have an estimate of flow and you do have an estimate of loading.
Yeah, although then that would be, if you wanted to estimate concentration, that would be just an average concentration.
Yeah, it'd be a flow weighted average. But
yeah, flow weighted. Yep. Yeah, flow averaged.
Mitch, did you want to jump in on that before we move on? No, they covered it.
Yep, I just wanted, Kateri already said it, just make sure, land size and land use are similar for the comparisons, because a lot of the ones we have, samples because there's something important there to sample.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good point.
Great. Okay, so now we get to some decision points for the external mass balance. The focus today will be on changing lake level as well as tributary versus the discharge monitoring report loads. So 2 decision points here. Utah Lake obviously has a changing lake level, so assigning what the lake boundary, what the edge of the lake will be for the modeling effort will be important. And then in watersheds where there is a wastewater treatment plant, how to address having these 2 different sources that are estimating nutrient loads and comparing them. So the purpose of our external loading calculations, these do not account for in-lake processes that impact the transformation of nutrients. This could be sediment uptake and release. It could be uptake from plants or phytoplankton, any, microbial processes, nitrification, denitrification, and so forth, as well as the biogeochemical impacts of wetting or drying. So according to sort of the goals of the external load, anything that's happening within the lake boundary is sort of immaterial to the actual load. There are other studies and RFPs that do document the importance of changing lake level and the effect of sediments on the nutrient conditions in Utah Lake. So those will be important to sort of evaluate alongside these external loading calculations. But that's not necessarily the purpose of the external load. It doesn't really care what happens to a nutrient load once it hits the lake. It's just basically quantifying what's happening once it crosses that boundary into the lake. Utah Lake experiences substantial changes in elevation. So over the last 10 years, it's changed in elevation by 10 feet, pretty substantial with according, changes in area and volume as well. There are several wetlands around the lake that do have the capacity to take up, release, or transform nutrients. But the caveat there is, how do we account for these areas if they are sometimes inundated with lake water and sometimes not? So the central question there will be, what defines the lake boundary? What constitutes the edge of the lake in terms of how we actually calculate that external load? So accounting for changing lake level, here's just a sort of summary of what the lake levels have looked like over the past 10 years. Just an important aspect for this study. So we're conducting calculating the average monthly loading across 2015 through 2020. So To use an average, we'll need to designate a single lake level across the period of record so that we can have comparable numbers. A really important elevation here is the compromise elevation, which is 4489.045 feet. I will note, so across the past 10 years, we've hit compromise elevation in 2020, so once over the past 5 years, and then it was 2 feet over compromise in 2011, so 2 times in the last 10 years. So compromise is a relevant elevation in terms of us, thinking about the changes in lake elevation, especially in the contemporary period in Utah Lake. Just to note for our sort of daily exceedance probability, how likely is the lake to exceed a specific lake stage on any given day? 4,481 feet is the minimum. It's always inundated, all the way up to 4,490 feet, which was exceeded 2% or 2.8% of the days in the last 10 years and 0% of the days in the last 5 years. I'll just note in 2020, the lake hit compromise, but it did not exceed compromise, which is why that exceedance probability is 0. But it is 0.4% if you're to think about 4,489 feet as a potential stage to exceed. So that's sort of the context, and this map also shows that visually. So 4481 is that lightest band of blue, and then all the way moving up to the darkest band of blue. Again, in 2011, the lake exceeded compromise, which is why that really dark portion actually is exceeding that the compromise line that's displayed in the sort of royal blue. So again, compromise is a relevant elevation for the lake. It's hit 2 times in the past 10 years and 1 time in the past 5. This is especially relevant for 2 watersheds of interest, Powell Slough, which is on the left, and Mill Race, which is which flows into Provo Bay on the right-hand side. In these maps, the compromise elevation is that edge of the blue shading, and you can see that part of that sort of land area is covered if we consider compromise elevation. If we look at these downstream monitoring sites, so we've got some DWQ and Wasatch Front Water Quality Council sites downstream here in Powell Slough. These are below compromise elevations. We have limited data for these sites. They're only able to be sampled when the lake is not inundated at those spots. Same for Mill Race. We've got some a downstream sampling site for Wasatch Front Water Quality Council that's below compromise. So again, we've got limited data if we were to use just the downstream monitoring sites. If we look at the variation in elevation that we've experienced over the past 6 years, this is showing the maximum elevation. So the dark shaded area is the maximum elevation. The driest year for the lake was 2016, and the wettest year was 2020 over this period. And then the minimum lake elevation is shown. So we're getting a substantial intra-annual variation in elevation, as well as substantial inter-year variation in lake level. Same for Powell Slough, we're getting both inter and intra-annual variation in elevation. I'll point out in 2020, when the lake reached compromise, Powell Slough is inundated with lake water. And just to note here, those kind of downstream sampling sites for DWQ and Wasatch Front Water Quality Council. So those would be underwater if we're considering the specific lake level of compromise. So that brings us to a decision point. So defining what the lake boundary is for the purposes of generating that external mass balance. The option A would be the compromise elevation. This would be the high elevation of those 6 years. Essentially here, if we were to choose option A, that would mean that the rationale would be any nutrients that are reaching sometimes inundated locations are considered low to the lake, regardless of the processing that might happen at low lake level, whether that's interacting with the sediments or macrophytes and so forth. Option B would be to use that low elevation and to still use those data points from the low elevation locations. And the rationale there would be that nutrients are only considered low to the lake if they reach an inundated location at the time of loading. So in order to actually do that, for option A, we would have to calculate a load at a point directly upstream of compromise rather than at the most downstream site. Option B would be to calculate loading at the most downstream location. The caveats there for option A we'd need to eliminate the downstream sampling sites for both entities, for Powell Slough and for Mill Race. And then the caveat for option B would be that there are limited data. So the sites are not sampled when they're inundated. It's impossible to generate a flow value if it's lake water. Option A would not account for any nutrient transformation occurring during those non-inundated periods when there might be meaningful, changes in the form of nutrients. And then at low elevation, any loading estimates would be biased toward times when the lake is at low level. So we wouldn't really have any data for those high lake level years in that case. So Heather, I think you've got a poll for everybody. I'd like your input. If it were me, I'd be inclined to choose option A, but I'm keen to hear from the science panel what your thoughts are on this.
So I have a Zoom poll for science panel members to respond to, but before we get to that, just want to give you a chance to chat if you want to say something or ask a question so that we have the best information both from Kateri and from your colleagues on the science panel so you can make a smart choice. Mike, question or comment?
Yeah, I put a comment in the chat box, but the way I'm thinking about it is if the nutrients get out into an area that's not directly connected to the lake, there's a good chance that when that lake area floods 6 months later, that those nutrients will be brought back into the system. So maybe over a longer time period, they are actually getting into the lake, even if in the very short time period they don't. That's my understanding of the way you've described it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other folks have thoughts or preferences there? And did I see you hop off mute there for a minute? Hi.
Yeah, on the other hand, it's only been 2 times in the last 20 years that it's hit that high level. So, most of the time the lake is lower and it's higher in concentration of nutrients. And that's when the blooms are more intense, is when the lake is lower. So would there be an option C where we do some intermediate lake elevation so that we account for both a little bit higher and a little bit lower? I mean, because you're catching one or the other extremes of the lake is what it seems like. So, and I don't think either one represents the majority of the time that the lake, the condition of the lake.
Kateri, is there a middle option?
Yeah, I think the caveat for a middle option is our actual sampling sites. So there's several sampling sites in the middle of Powell Slough, but they're not sampled often. We have a lot of data for this downstream site. We have a lot of data for the site just above compromise. And the same for Mill Race. So we've got data, we've got a bunch of sampling points that are directly above or directly upstream of compromise, and one site that's that's below compromise, but nothing sort of in between. So I think I think that's a really good point that, you might want to capture the time when, the actual majority of the lake elevation is happening. But I don't know if we have the data to actually calculate that, at least at this point.
Okay. Hans, what do you think?
Well, I was just going to respond to Mike's preference for A and want to get his take on, inundated locations depends on how long the water stays there, but denitrification can be pretty important, or maybe even infixation. It depends on what's growing in there. So what's your thought on that, Mike?
I do agree with your point. And the other thing that could happen is if you discharge nutrients into an area that's going to subsequently dry out, that might greatly increase the likelihood that, for example, phosphorus would react with some other constituents, that it might bind with calcium or something like that if you take it through a process of complete desiccation. And then when you re-wet it, it might not unreact with those compounds. So it is complicated. It is complicated. And maybe the answer is somewhere in between, but how do we implement that somewhere in between? That's the tricky part. So I agree 100% with what you had to say, Hans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something in between, but the problem is there's no sampling there. So yeah.
Well, I mean, even in between in terms of it is available or it's not available, but what does that even mean? Do we just say it's half because that's just arbitrary?
Right.
You know, so we don't want to just do something that's totally arbitrary either.
Yeah.
Soren, what do you think?
I don't know if maybe this came up and I just missed it, but in terms of sort of time or work limitations, would there be an argument for doing both option A and B? And then we have bounds looking at both of these assumptions, depending on what assumption we make. And I mean, I can see an argument for that anyway, just in terms of, you know, since the lake levels are actively controlled to some level, it'd be interesting to see how that compares to what we expect with the nutrient loading at those different lake levels between years and based on how much water passes through.
Mm-hmm. And if you're just tracking the chat, James, maybe thinking along similar lines there, Soren. Mike, go ahead.
Well, I'm also thinking it's only affecting a few sites, and so maybe in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about something that's only a rounding error, you know. So how big of a difference would we come up with for total loading if we took A or B? You know, kind of like getting at what Soren is asking. Maybe A and B actually are pretty similar to each other, and so we don't really need to worry about it much.
There would be value in seeing that. If they're similar, then it's like, okay, it doesn't matter about these specific assumptions. Yeah.
Mhm.
Because you're only talking about sites.
Mm-hmm.
So some preliminary results for Powell Slough and Mill Race. Those are two that have a pretty large fraction of the load to the lake, given that they have wastewater treatment plants. The preliminary difference based on, you know, not implementing any of the choices that we've discussed so far, there's about a doubling, you know, if you use the downstream versus upstream estimates for loading for each of those. Again, that's not a necessarily final number, but there was a pretty substantial difference. And I think it's because, you know, if we only are using those times when the lake is at low level, there were very few samples. So it could be biased, you know, in terms of underestimating the load or the other way around.
Mitch,
So
I like A even more.
okay, you're
I
leaving.
was going to step in. I mean, A is a nice boundary. We can all like, it's an elevation that is relevant, you know, hitting it once a decade, you know, like you wouldn't make a flood map based on once a decade. I'm digressing here, but yeah, I'm going for A. And I feel like these lower ones just kind of brings up the attenuation question. And then we still have that to address. I mean, right, it still doesn't make it irrelevant if we stick with the option A.
Mm-hmm.
It just goes on to the thing of what happens when it's in the lake and cycling, right? All the studies we're going with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Ryan, you were saying that you agree, it sounds like maybe with using both. Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you, sir. Anybody else have science panelists have other thoughts to share? You agree with something that's been said? So Kateri, what are just to the question that was raised, what are the sort of budget and level of work implications of doing both and then comparing?
yeah, pretty negligible on my end. You know, it's probably 10 extra minutes of work. So I think we could accomplish that and do a little report out to everybody.
Okay. Because I have a poll asking them to choose, but if both is an option, I like Samuel, can you amend my poll real quick, or do I need to do it?
I think I would like to know, you know,
Mm-hmm.
if there is a preference one way or the other, if we had to choose.
Okay, hold on.
Or do folks feel very strongly that they'd like to hear both? I guess that would be
Okay. Both. I'm editing my poll. There we go. All right. Okay, so let's just see what folks think. You should now see on your screen a fancy schmancy Zoom poll. Only science panel members should be participating, and there are 9 of you because we're missing 1. So let's look for 9 responses to my poll. 7, 8, eeny, meeny, miny, I need a 9. It doesn't tell me who does it. Okay, I got 9. And we are of fairly common mind there for doing both. Kateri, does the person who made this response, only one of you said to use compromise elevation. Anyone would want to quickly clarify why you're still committed to compromise?
I can go with both.
Yeah. Okay, you're cool. Great. All righty. So, Kateri, let's try both and see what shakes out.
Sounds good.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Last thoughts on that one before we move on? Cool. Carry on.
Awesome. Okay, so that brings us to our second decision point, the discharge monitoring report and tributary monitoring data. So basically in any watershed with a wastewater treatment plant, we have two estimates of load. We have one that's estimated from direct monitoring of the tributary and one that is reporting direct discharges from the wastewater treatment plant. That obviously only includes the wastewater treatment plant and not any natural loads. So we need to decide whether to generate loads from one or the other or a mix of both. Just a bit of context here. So here's a comparison of the flows for the monitored sites in the DMR reports. I've just noted the watershed with the specific wastewater treatment plant in parentheses for each of these. So there's 6 watersheds, 7 wastewater treatment plants with Payson and Salem being both in Benjamin Slough. So here's the annual flow estimated by monitored tributary data, and then the annual flow reported from the DMR data. Again, this is only the wastewater treatment plant outflow. So I just wanted to note, I think I've got, there we go. In watersheds where the wastewater treatment plant is farther from the lake monitoring site, the percent of annual flow is much lower for the DMR data than it is for the monitored flow. So this would be the case for Spring Creek, Springville, Dry Creek, Spanish Fork, and then Benjamin Slough. Benjamin Slough is pictured here. You've got those 2 wastewater treatment plants, and then the actual monitoring sites are much closer to the lake. So potentially some other flows coming into play there. Timpanogos has a really nice match. Those sites are really close together. I wouldn't hang my hat on Powell Slough right now because this number was generated from the really limited downstream data. Mill Race, comes out fairly similar, although the monitored flow is a bit larger than the DMR report. So in terms of a water balance, we're seeing quite a big difference, and it's dependent on how far the wastewater treatment plants are from the edge of the lake.
Okay, wait, hold on. Mike has a question on that previous slide. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just looking at these data and I'm wondering if what these seem to indicate is that for these discharges that are distant from the lake, if a lot of that water ends up taking a subsurface flow path to the lake. We don't think it's all just evaporating, do we?
So if we're comparing, so the monitored flow is higher than the DMR flow. So that would mean it would be gaining water moving downstream. Or there would be a flow adjacent to the
Most of the DMR flow is the flow coming out of the treatment plant.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, my apologies.
Understood. So it's the opposite of what I just said.
Yeah, so it's the opposite. So yeah, we're not seeing any indication of losing water coming out of the wastewater treatment plants that's not accounted for in the monitored data.
My mistake.
No worries.
Darren, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just going to add that, there are just numerous, almost countless springs all over the place. There's a really high groundwater, so that all makes sense with all of our observations. So yeah.
Great. That's good to know that the institutional knowledge is matching up with the data.
And Mitch, you were off mute there for a second. Did you want to say something? Nope. Cool.
Oh, nope.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right.
So the choice here, we've got potentially 3 options and this is for the question of generating a load based on specific data. The first option would be estimating nutrient loads based on tributary data. The benefit here is that it's incorporating both wastewater and natural loads. The caveat is that the estimated loads are lower than or equivalent to option B, which would be to use the DMR data. So oddly, the load is lower if we're using the monitored data or roughly equivalent. Whereas if we were to use the DMR data, this would incorporate only the wastewater loads. The caveat here is that upstream tributary monitoring data is limited, so it would be difficult to quantify the natural loads in combination with the DMR data. The how this would impact the load. The estimated load would be higher than or equivalent to option A in that case. Option C would be to use a mix of the tributary and DMR data. So this is sort of matching up with the water budget in places where the water budget is roughly similar, where the wastewater treatment plant is very near the tributary outflow. We could use the DMR data as the nutrient budget, and then in the case where the tributary data is far from, or the wastewater treatment plant is far from the tributary outflow, you could use the tributary data because that's clearly making up more of the actual water budget.
So we have Mike's got his hand up. We got a question from James in the chat. Let's take those. And then similar folks as before, I'd love to have you just share your preliminary thoughts, questions, or comments before I pull you to get to a decision point. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll let James go first since I've been talking a lot.
Right. So James's question is, what are the stream flows at or above the point source flows?
Yeah, so these weren't a focus so far, but as far as I know, these had pretty limited data, at least in comparison to the data that we have from the more downstream sites. Maybe Scott Daly, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, at least for the stuff that DWQ collects, we do have a lot more data resolution at the lake interface. There have been some other monitoring programs within the last 5 years, since 2015, that have more, that have collected other tributary sites that are upstream of the POTWs for other purposes. So those would be for waste load analysis development and our intensive monitoring programs. So there is probably some, but the resolution probably doesn't compare to what we have for the samples at the lake interface with those downstream locations.
Okay, Mike?
So if the streams are gaining water downstream of the wastewater treatment plant discharge point, does that mean that the concentrations are declining by 50%? Because presumably they're gaining water with a much lower nutrient concentration? Or are the concentrations comparable to what's being reported at the discharge point?
Yeah, so the concentrations they're lower, but not in proportion. So I did a quick comparison of option A versus option B. And so if there was a dilution in concentration, you would still expect the load to be about the same or greater in the tributary data than in the DMR. But in all cases, the DMR was either equivalent or greater than the tributary data. So in some cases, the concentration is lower at the lake interface in the tributary, but not in proportion with what we might expect, based on a mixing model type approach.
Okay. Mike, you're still thinking?
I'm always thinking.
Fair enough. Mitch, what's on your mind?
You know, I was in to go for option C, but I was going to reference Beer Creek, which wasn't on this, but I was going to say Salem and Payson discharged to Beer Creek, which is a small creek, and so it has water they're discharging to, but then they're using it for flood irrigation. And then my whole point was I would be voting for some of these treatment plants that are really far away from the lake to use the lake boundary loads, and then if people have problems with the streams, they could do a TMD on the stream if they thought there was too much nutrients, or eutrophication within that specific stream. That would be my vote.
And Mitch, that would be relevant for Benjamin Slough. So that's the catchment that Beer Creek would be in this formulation. So perfect.
Okay, that's
no,
right.
no, not at all. Yeah, no.
Okay. Other questions or comments, Darren?
No, I was just going to say that, and Benjamin Slough are one and the same. So yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So we have 3 options on our poll. Any last thoughts on any of the options before I hear what your preference is? All right. So just as before, looking for 9 responses to my poll here: trib data, DMR data, or the mix. I got 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. There we have it. And everyone, it thinks.
Wow.
Same thing. Hit that option C.
Wonderful.
All right.
It's great to have consensus.
This is a smart group of people. All right. What do you got?
I think that's all I had. And I think we're ahead of schedule.
Oh, don't say that. That always ruins it. There. Yeah. Fantastic. So let's hear from our community folks, our observers, for a few minutes. There have been some questions and comments in the chat that we could check in on, but if any member, any observer, member of the public wants to weigh in, now be a good time. You can tell me you want to do that by raising your hand. You can probably just unmute yourself. I'll know that you're coming. Put something in the chat. What do you got? Dan, go ahead, and then Dave.
Yeah, I just want to, I've said this for years and years and years, ever since I can remember, but my main concern is not about the compromise or above compromise or the low levels or any of that. It's the rate of change. It's always been the rate of change of those water levels, you know, first a dam and then a pump house. And so as long as we capture the history of the implementation of those things, I think that's critical, because I think that's been it's almost like this changing water level has literally scrubbed the shorelines of the lake, just from my own personal experience. And so anyway, that's all I got.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And Dave?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
I was just wondering, on those graphs about evaporation loss, one of them looked like 71%, the other one looked like 55%. So I was just, which one were we thinking was more correct?
Do you want to pop that back up?
Yeah, let me pop that back up. Let me find my share button again.
Okay.
So, okay, so the numbers on the left, this is the hydrologic budget for this study, 2015 through 2020. That's where we have evaporation making over 70% of the outflow budget. And David, if this is, I think you're maybe referencing
that's
this.
The one I was
yeah, so this was the Sue and von Stackelberg, the EFDC WASP.
Okay.
And this was for that different set of years. So the Jordan River made up a greater proportion, or had a much larger flow during those years. So that's why that number changed a bit. The evaporation that we used was fairly similar. It wouldn't have changed the total magnitude of that percentage difference. So that was attributed to the decrease in Jordan River flow during this later time period.
Okay, so anywhere between 40 and 70%?
Yeah, depending on the year. Yeah,
year.
we're going
Okay.
from, and I forget what years they were. I think I've got that on this slide. Yeah, so going from 2006 to 2020, that number changes drastically based on how much the Jordan River would change. And then evaporation obviously makes a difference, you know, what the actual lake level is, because you're going to get more evaporation per unit area, you know, if it's water versus if it's exposed sediment. So that's another caveat to maybe think about.
Mitch, you have a comment on that same point?
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Was evaporation calculated as, you know, whatever didn't go out the Jordan River had to be evaporation, or was it based on, you know, fluctuating water levels, you know, a certain rate of evaporation that happens?
Yeah, so
a reality check, because I think we were all like 70%. So.
Yeah, it seemed like a lot. So I should note that the evaporation, that was in units of centimeters in the EFDC output. And then I applied the area of Utah Lake at compromise to actually get the volume. So that might be a consideration, you know, to maybe vary that estimate based on the changing lake area.
I think if we fine tune that would bring it down a little bit.
Yeah, because that would be basically the maximum potential evaporation amount.
Okay.
Yeah, good point.
Mike?
So if I understand correctly, you're calculating evaporation based on the surface area of the lake and what, temperature and wind, or what are you doing?
No, so it was the EFDC output for evaporation. So that was already calculated in a rate, centimeters per, I forget if it was a daily measurement. So centimeters per day.
Estimate?
Yeah, sorry, what was that?
It's a modeled estimate?
Yeah, modeled estimate. And
What's
then
the estimate
applying
if you
the.
just take the difference between the inflow and the outflow?
So the lake was gaining in elevation during that period. So we didn't assume that the change in storage was zero.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good point. But couldn't we just fit a non-steady state model to that and calculate evap? I mean, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, one could if we think it's a good idea to balance the model on evaporation rather than not balancing the model.
At the very least, try to calculate evaporation directly, just as the difference between in and outflow with
Sure.
steady state model. It's just a mass balance problem. So it's just a slightly more complicated mass balance problem. But
Yeah,
really
but very straightforward. Yeah, I think you're right.
compare them.
Kateri, we have another question. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, a quick point on the water balance. Utah Lake is a highly regulated reservoir, and the Division of Water Rights has a number of models and spreadsheets where they do detailed accounting of all the different water rights transfers, what goes in and out. So that might be another data point to compare to, to substantiate or validate the hydrology model. And then I guess secondly, is I think looking at both high lake and low lake is a great idea, because not only at the low lake do you have assimilation of nutrients along the shoreline as the water goes through those wetlands and across the lake bed, but you also have significant ET. So not only are there less nutrient concentrations, the nutrient concentrations drop, but you also see a substantial reduction in flow that actually gets into the open water. So not to complicate things further, but
if I were going to complicate things further, this is what it would
right.
be. Yeah. Okay. Other members of the public are observers. Also, there's a couple steering committee members who've joined us today. Anybody have any additional questions or comments on the CNP study? Nope. Okay. And Kateri, looks like you're going to follow up with Jeff just on the water rights database and such. Okay.
Yes.
Cool. And then are you going to sort of try to use those to somehow calibrate or just sort of ground truth, so to speak, the evap modeling data? Is that the plan?
Yeah, that would be the plan.
Okay, cool.
Great.
All right. Anyone else? Questions, comments on CNP? Yep. All righty then. In that case, Scott, I do believe that you are up. First of all, Kateri, thank you very much. Lots of support for your work and people appreciating all the things. And thanks for bringing us clear questions that we can answer so we can give you direction, and we all know what we think we told you to do. So that's great.
I'm excited to share data with everybody. We're really close.
It's gonna be awesome. With that, let's transition. Scott, you have a P-binding study question, comment, update for the group?
Yeah, that's right. So this is part update, and then part we'd like to hear some guidance on kind of putting us into a position to be able to allow the BYU team to start implementing the study. So Josh Lamont and his team, Greg Carling and Steve Nelson, are developing the sampling plan currently right now, and assembling the literature review documents. And we have scheduled a follow-up subgroup meeting with them for the 27th. We should have a draft of those reports to the subgroup in advance of that meeting. And then kind of the point of that meeting is to dive into any issues or comments that the subgroup has on sampling protocols, and try to resolve those issues and point towards a final document so that they can initiate work on the lake within the next couple of weeks or so. And so the question, I guess, for everyone here is, or for the science panel members, is are you supportive of the approach for us to continue working in the subgroup to finalize those deliverables and then to initiate work? Or is there a second option where you would like to have that material come back to science panel meeting or to the full science panel for approval? And certainly if we worked in the subgroup, with the subgroup to finalize those products, they would be circulated to the rest of the group for, your information.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, just for folks who haven't memorized all the things, remind us who's on the subgroup, if you would.
Oh, on the spot, I should have made a list.
Samuel, can you remind us who is on the subgroup?
Yeah. So it's Mike, Brett, Mitch, and James Martin. And is that everyone? Oh, and Janice
and Theron.
And Theron.
Oh, and Theron. Okay, so a whole crew of folks. Yeah.
A lot of a nice diversity too of folks as well. So Scott, check out Mike's question in the chat. While you're looking at that, anybody have any thoughts? Are you cool with things carrying on with the subgroup that's about half of you? Or do you want things just to come back to this full group? Hans, question, comment?
Actually, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I meant to raise my thumb.
But there was a choice, so you can't raise your thumb or your hand on a choice. Which one were you raising your hand for? For a subgroup?
I'm fine with the path of least resistance on this.
Okay, fantastic. Anyone feels strongly about bringing it back to the full group in lieu of continuing to have the subgroup work on this on your behalf? Okay, Scott, what are your thoughts on Mike's question in the chat there?
Yeah, and so I guess for everyone's information, I mean, during our subgroup conversations, and Mike may have mentioned it in one of our last meetings, but Maria Dietrich, University of Toronto, is that correct, Mike?
Correct.
She does quite a bit of work that's similar to what we're doing with the phosphorus binding study, focused on calcite specifically. And Mike has advised us to kind of pull her in as a second or a supplemental advisor on this project. There was an offline communication with some other members of the science panel or in the subgroup kind of supportive of that process. I haven't started charting that path, Mike. It would be great to work offline with you to kind of understand what you think her role would be, and then to maybe put together I don't know if it's a formal contractual arrangement with a scope of work, or if it's just her serving as a technical advisor. I do know that Josh Lamont, the PI for this project, has committed to reaching out to her and get some information kind of at the outset. But to pull her in in a formal capacity, it would be great to hear some thoughts on what you all think that looks like and what we would specifically ask her to do.
Yeah, Mike, were you thinking formal capacity or informal capacity? Or
somewhat formal. I mean, I've spoken with her for quite a while. I mean, I had a long conversation with her, and she said that she has a project where she's looking at these sort of interactions between phosphorus and calcium in Lake Ontario. So it's a project, she has an ongoing project. She's very interested in these sort of mineralogical interactions in general. And she said she's got collaborations with people that are doing this on Lake Balaton in Hungary. And I just think she's has a knowledge of this particular topic that at least greatly goes beyond what I do. And so I find that, very interesting. And she sounded like she was interested in working with us a little bit. And I just think we want to kind of like incentivize any investment of time that she has. So if she got paid, some small amount to, sit in on some of our meetings and participate in our conversations, that would make more worth her while. Like if we're asking her to volunteer like 5 or 10 hours of her time for free, she might, find that it's hard for her to find that time. And 5 or 10 hours from her might be really valuable for us, because I think she'll have insights that could really inform us and get us thinking about things maybe in ways that we wouldn't have thought about them without her feedback.
Janice, you're nodding. Do you know her and share Mike's perspective?
I don't know her, but I completely agree. I think having somebody who's at the top of their game on a topic is worth including in our study.
Okay. Yeah. Mitch, you're also nodding. I see thumbs up from Soren. Anyone troubled by at least reaching out to Maria and seeing if this is interesting to her, if she's willing, what she might be looking for in terms of time commitment and compensation? See all the thumbs up. Oh, everyone's very thummy uppy. Fantastic. Scott, what would a next step on that look like? Is that you, maybe and Josh reaching out to her together?
could I propose that Mike and I reach out to her and just set up an initial conversation and talk specifically about her involvement and what we collectively think that looks like?
Mike, do you accept being drafted to that?
Yeah, I like that idea.
Okay, and then, you know, we could potentially work with Josh as a, you know, potential vehicle for contracting with her, but we don't need to talk about that now.
Okay.
You also talked about maybe having her sub through Tetra too.
Yes, yeah, there are a couple potential options that we can consider.
First, we got to charm her and make her want to help us with our hard problems. All right.
Sounded interested.
She did?
Yeah.
But, okay, so just be extra charming now, so she's still interested, the two of you. Fantastic. Any other, Scott, questions, comments on P-BY, anything that you need from this crew? We're good? Anybody else have thoughts? All right. All right, Scott, what do you know about our other science panel business? Just the research plan situation? And
yeah, so the bioassay study, Zach Onderud and his team have wrapped up with a final report. We worked with our subgroup there, Hans and Mitch and Ryan, and then Kateri played a supporting role there as well. But so that report is essentially final. We were working with Zach to develop kind of a fact sheet to highlight the take homes that could be sent to the science panel. There were a couple of next steps I identified there. I mean, Zach has pretty much satisfied his obligation for that project. But Hans had suggested in those discussions that we circulate that final report to Mike Brett, have Mike look at it from that topic of bioavailability and calcite and all of the things that he's interested in, make sure that, you know, we hadn't missed anything. And then we'll circulate it to the rest of the science panel. The next steps for that one, I think, you know, the science panel with some support probably from Tetra Tech would it'd be probably a good idea to further develop that fact sheet for communicating the findings to the steering committee. And we're trying to kind of carve out a path for when that might happen over the next couple of months. And if you remember last time we talked about this idea of potentially reporting out on the current state of our knowledge related to each of the charge questions. And so as we take on that work, it seemed like it would fit well with kind of developing that fact sheet as another tool for communicating the results to the steering committee.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's essentially, yeah, that's it for bioassay.
Hold on. Any questions, concerns, or troubled feelings about that? Cool. Next.
Okay. Littoral sediment. This was the one that was out for bid several times last fall without any proposals. We have identified a potential path forward working with Soren Brothers at Utah State University. He has assembled a team that's interested in doing this work. We're currently working on the contractual side of things and hopeful that we can put an agreement together over the next few weeks. And timeline for that is, you know, we think that we can accomplish the work that was laid out in our original RFP between now and most of the field work occurring in late summer and fall, and then reporting out results in early winter or late winter, early spring. And this will, I think some of that work will be done in partnership with some GIS analysis that the GIS components will probably be handled by Jake Vanderlaan and DWQ or myself. And just realizing and reviewing some of the stuff for Kateri's presentation and helping with generating lake elevation maps, I realized that the stage storage capacity curves that James developed earlier or later last year probably get us 90% of the way towards completing those GIS components, which is really great. So stay tuned for more information on that. Hopefully we can bring Soren and his team on soon. And make progress over the summer and fall. Probably a pretty similar work plan where we'll set out to develop an approved sampling plan, probably anticipate another subgroup, as long as you all think that those are still working well. It seems to be a good way to kind of make progress in between meetings and stuff. So that's worked out well to help tackle some of these more highly focused tasks. So that's littoral sediments. Any questions with that one?
I don't see any questions. Okay, cool. And you got a thumbs up from James. Sweet.
Okay, excellent. And then the last one is for now anyway, is the Utah Lake Model Development Project. So this is the EFDC and WASP enhancements. And then also included in that RFP is initial development of a watershed model. We received a few proposals and we're currently in process of evaluating them now. Our first evaluation team meeting will be next week, followed by another meeting the following week. And so I'm hopeful that within 2 weeks or so, we can make a selection and start working on an award package. And that would put us in position to have someone on board within a month to 6 weeks, depending on the final contractual part of the project.
Fantastic. All right. Any questions or comments on that? All right, we are clicking right along. In that case, I would love to hear if there's any comments on any topics, either on the agenda or not. We have about 5 minutes left to hear anything else from our observers. Public, would you like to publicly comment? You could take yourself off mute. You could turn on your camera and wave at me. You could tell me in the chat. I'm not seeing anything come up. So perhaps that means that we are on a good on a good path there. So Mike Brett in the chat is going in the same direction I was headed, which is next meeting. I'm going to pop up a meeting poll here for a quick minute and ask you all to look at your calendars while we chat a little bit about this question of in-person. I actually have gotten a couple of questions myself about, are we going to meet in person? We're seeing reduction in mask mandates, seeing an increase in vaccinations and comfort. I don't know that we have the people on this call who can decide, but Scott and Eric, have either of you heard anything state-wise about this? Any updates?
Yeah, well, the state of Utah is discontinued the mask mandate and all state office buildings are opening up again at the end of May. We're all going back to work. And, many of the precautions that have been in place will be no longer mandatory, but voluntary. So folks that would like to take them can. We haven't put much thought into coming back to, in-person meetings, but, in talking with Erica, the one question would be, we know that, all of your institutions have their own set of rules about travel and such. And I think we're, within DWQ and the state system, we're getting close to being able to come back to having in-person meetings. So I don't know that it's too far off. But I think it would, one part of that puzzle is while we figure out what exactly we can and can't do on my side, understanding what all limitations you have and start pulling those pieces together. Because if half of you can't meet in person and travel or aren't comfortable doing so, I think that is important to know.
Okay, we might maybe just follow up offline with folks with maybe a poll about A, what are you allowed to do? B, what are you comfortable doing? And C, is this a moving target, which it seems to be for a fair number of organizations, right? Because things are happening fast here. Eric, did you have any additional information or preference or thoughts just related to in-person meetings?
No, that was a great summary from Scott. We're open to them. We're kind of doing probably still 70% virtual and 30% in person, but that's usually just based on the other participants in the meeting. So,
okay. How about Samuel and I follow up just with all of you and see again what your preference is, what your rules are, so we can start to make a plan. It might not be imminent that we get back together in person, but we could at least maybe get a sense of when that could happen. I say get back together. I've never been with you in person. That would be so fun. We might just want to do the same thing just with the steering committee, don't you think, Scott? As long as we're doing that. Rich, we should check with the steering committee too. Same question, you think? Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's right.
Great. All right. Any last thoughts for the good of the group? Excellent. Well, thank you all as always for a fantastic discussion. Kateri, thank you for a really great presentation with really clear questions so we all know where to from here. As always, if you have questions, comments, curiosities, whatever you got, give us a shout, either me or Scott or Samuel's always a good one. Otherwise, lovely to see your shining faces, and be safe, be well out there in the world, and we'll see you in some format. I'm going to leave this poll up here for a quick minute, so if you haven't gotten to it, please do, but it looks like a good bunch of you have done it. So steering or science panel members, if you haven't, get after it if you would. Otherwise, the rest of you are free to go. Hey, there's Greg. Hi, Greg. Now I saw your shining face. And Greg makes healthy choices at barbecues. Please know that.
Right. Yeah, I've been working in my lab, so I didn't think you guys would want to see me walking back and forth across my screen.
All good, man. It's nice to see you. All right, everybody. If you're staying to do the poll, fantastic. Everybody else, go back and do the things that the world's looking for you to do. Take care of yourself. We're adjourned.
Thank you.